I am 34 years old, and last year my wife and I moved into an old house in rural Vermont, in a small town near Montpelier. The house dates back to the 1940s, one of those places that has been renovated a few times but still keeps a lot of the original structure. We left Burlington because we wanted something quieter, less noise, and we found this house at a price that was too good to ignore. I work remotely in IT, and she's a nurse at the local hospital, so it made sense. When we moved in, we were still in that excited phase, unpacking boxes, replacing a few old things, doing small repairs ourselves. Nothing structural, just simple stuff like old outlets, yellowed light switches, that kind of thing. The house seemed solid, firm wooden floors, nothing creaking beyond normal. The attic was small, accessed by a pull-down ladder in the hallway, but we barely went up there because it was just old insulation and dust. At first, nothing seemed unusual. At least that's what I thought. That particular night, I was replacing an outlet in the guest bedroom upstairs, under the most slanted part of the roof. It was winter, and it was already dark outside by around 5 in the evening. The heater was running, that constant sound of air moving through the ducts, and my wife was downstairs in the kitchen making dinner. When I removed the outlet plate, I noticed the screw was slightly loose and the electrical box seemed deeper than normal. When I pulled the outlet out a little, I felt no resistance behind it. It wasn't the usual tight space with wiring and wood. It felt empty. I used my phone's flashlight and shined it inside, expecting to see beams and wires. But the beam of light just disappeared into darkness. It was too deep to be just plumbing space. I moved the phone slowly, adjusting the angle, and that's when I saw something that didn't look right. The insulation was compressed, marked, as if someone had pressed their body against it repeatedly. At first, I thought it might be from some old renovation, but the marks looked too recent, like someone had leaned there on purpose. I stayed there for a few seconds, phone pointed into that void, trying to process what I was seeing. The flash reflected off the fiberglass insulation, and it was clear it wasn't just random sagging. There was a pattern, like someone had put their weight against that wall multiple times. I even reached my arm through the opening as far as I could, but I felt nothing except cold air. Too cold, actually. It was strange because the heating was on and the rest of the room was comfortable. But from inside that space, there was a steady draft of cold air. It didn't smell strongly of mold or anything specific, just that dry scent of old dust mixed with something more recent, like plastic. I called my wife's name, asking if she knew whether anyone had worked on that wall before. She answered from downstairs that she had no idea. The house had been renovated before the sale, but according to the realtor, nothing structural had been altered. I couldn't let it go. Instead of just putting the outlet back and forgetting it, I grabbed a screwdriver and started widening the drywall opening just enough to see better. The plaster came off too easily, like it had already been disturbed before. When I made the opening larger and stuck my phone inside again, I finally realized it wasn't just a gap between beams. It was a long, narrow space, like a corridor between two parallel walls. I slowly moved the light left and then right, and the beam illuminated something on the floor of that space. It took me a few seconds to identify it because it was partially covered in dust, but when I adjusted the focus, I saw clearly a black flashlight lying on its side, and a few inches beyond it, a clear plastic water bottle, slightly crushed. It didn't look old. It wasn't covered in cobwebs or heavily coated in dirt. It looked like it had been left there recently. At that moment, I felt a knot in my stomach I couldn't explain. Because for someone to leave those things there, they would have had to enter that space somehow. And I had no idea how that would be possible without breaking the wall. I knelt on the bedroom floor for a while, just staring at that opening in the wall, trying to come up with a logical explanation. My first thought was that maybe a contractor had left it during renovations. Maybe someone had opened the wall to run wiring and accidentally dropped something. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. The flashlight was intact, it didn't look like it had fallen accidentally. And the bottle was positioned strangely, lying almost parallel to the wall as if someone had placed it there deliberately. I called my wife again and asked her to come upstairs. When she saw the size of the hole in the wall, she immediately asked what I was doing. I showed her inside with my phone. She went quiet for a few seconds, then asked if it was some kind of technical crawl space. I told her I had never seen anything like that on any blueprint, and that the gap was too wide to be just insulation. We went downstairs and grabbed the folder with the house documents the realtor had given us. We spread the blueprints across the kitchen table while dinner went cold. The only sounds were the low hum of the heater and the wind lightly hitting the windows. I started comparing the bedroom's measurements with the floor plan. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The external width of the house in that section didn't match the interior measurements of the bedroom and hallway next to it. There was a small discrepancy, but enough to fit exactly that kind of narrow space between walls. And nowhere on the plans was there any mention of a technical corridor or access there. It was as if that gap officially didn't exist. My wife suggested it could be an old measurement error, something common in older houses, but all I could think about was the flashlight and the fact that someone would have needed a way in. I went back upstairs alone while she stayed downstairs trying to call a friend who worked in construction. I didn't want to admit it, but I was starting to feel uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. The upstairs hallway felt quieter than usual, as if the heater had softened, even though I knew that was just my imagination. When I re-entered the guest bedroom, the air felt colder near the exposed wall. I knelt again and shined my phone inside, moving the light slowly, trying to see how far the space extended. The beam revealed only a narrow corridor, raw wood on both sides, insulation and dust covering the floor. But as I moved the light, I realized it didn't end there. It continued to the right, toward the attic. I stayed still for a few seconds, listening. At first, nothing. Then I thought I heard something faint, like a very subtle dragging sound, almost like fabric brushing against wood. I held my breath to listen more carefully. The sound stopped. I tried to convince myself it could be wind causing the structure to shift. Old houses make noise, everyone knows that. Still, my heart was beating faster than it should have. I went into the hallway, pulled down the attic ladder, and climbed up with my phone in hand. Up there it was cramped, just beams, old insulation, and that strong smell of heated dust. The flashlight beam lit up particles in the air. I carefully stepped across the beams, feeling the wood solid beneath my feet. I looked around for any sign of recent disturbance, removed panels, anything out of place. Nothing seemed touched. The insulation looked intact. There was no obvious passage leading into that hidden wall space. While I stood there trying to make sense of it, I heard it again. Not in the attic, below me. A short, muffled sound like a small impact against wood, coming directly from the direction of the guest bedroom where I had opened the wall. My stomach went cold instantly. I climbed down from the attic faster than I'd like to admit, nearly slipping on the pull-down ladder because my hands were sweating despite the cold. When I reached the hallway, I stood still, listening. The house was too silent. No footsteps, no voices. Just the faint sound of the TV downstairs and the wind brushing against the side of the house. I entered the guest bedroom slowly. The hole in the wall was exactly as I had left it. I knelt again and aimed my phone inside. For a few seconds, nothing looked different. The flashlight was still there. The bottle, too. But then I noticed something that made me freeze. The bottle wasn't in exactly the same position. I remembered it leaning slightly left, resting against the insulation. Now it was more upright, like it had rolled a few inches. I tried to convince myself I must have misremembered. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became that something had changed. I called my wife upstairs immediately. I explained the sound I had heard in the attic. She went pale but tried to stay calm, suggesting maybe the bottle had rolled due to vibration from the heating system or wind. That was possible. Old houses vibrate. But something felt wrong. Then I heard it again. A faint sound from inside the space. Not loud, almost like controlled breathing, very low, interrupted by a light brush. My wife grabbed my arm tightly and whispered for us to get out of there. And for the first time that night, I was certain it wasn't just the house settling. We left the room quietly and went downstairs. I called 911 and told them we believed someone might be inside the structure of the house. While we waited, we stood in the kitchen near the back door in case we needed to leave quickly. I turned off the TV to hear better. The silence felt suffocating. At one point, we heard a sound upstairs. Slow weight shifting on wood, a restrained step, then another. My wife started crying softly. Then a sharp, clear sound, something striking the inside of the wall, from the exact direction of the opened drywall. When the police arrived, they searched upstairs and broke open more of the wall. The narrow corridor extended nearly to the attic. There were fresh marks in the dust on the floor like someone had crawled through there. And near the attic, behind insulation, was a small concealed opening leading directly into that hidden corridor. The officer said someone very thin could fit through. There were also light footprints in the attic dust that looked recent. They found no one. No forced doors, no broken windows. But the flashlight was modern. The bottle still had water inside. We left that night and stayed at a hotel. I barely slept. What keeps replaying in my head is the fact that while I was replacing that outlet, someone could have been just inches away from me, inside the wall, hearing everything. And when I held my phone inside that space, I'm almost certain the breathing I heard wasn't an echo. It was someone trying to stay quiet while I stood only inches away. Story 2. I am 41 years old, and last winter my wife, our 2 children, and I moved into an old house in Pennsylvania, in a small town near Scranton. The house was built in 1938, one of those solid structures with creaking stairs and radiators that had been replaced by modern central heating. We left an apartment because we wanted more space for the kids, especially now that my oldest son is 12 and needed his own room. I work as a hospital maintenance technician and have always liked handling house repairs myself. When we bought the property, the inspector said everything was functional, including the heating system. It was January with temperatures below zero almost every night. At first, everything seemed normal, except for one detail we noticed during the first week. The back bedroom on the second floor was always colder than the rest of the house. It wasn't just an impression. The moment you stepped inside, you could feel the difference on your skin. Initially, I thought it might be old insulation or maybe poor window sealing. But that wasn't it. The window was new, the seals intact. The central heating worked fine in the other bedrooms. You could feel warm air coming strongly through the vents. In that specific room, though, the airflow felt weaker, sometimes almost non-existent. My son started complaining that at night it felt like the room was pulling cold from the wall. I went in a few times in the middle of the night to check, and the temperature really did seem to drop faster there than in the rest of the house. The air had that dry winter smell, mixed with something slightly stale like trapped dust. I ran my hand along the exterior wall, and it was noticeably colder than the others. It wasn't just uncomfortable. It was strange, especially since the heating system had been inspected before the sale. After a few weeks of ignoring it, I decided that night I would finally check the ventilation system for that room. It was a Friday, already dark outside, around 6 degrees C. My wife was in the living room watching TV with the kids while I went upstairs with a flashlight and tools. I removed the floor vent cover and immediately felt colder air coming from it, different from the rest of the house. I reached inside and noticed the airflow was irregular, so I decided to access the small attic above the bedrooms to follow the ductwork. I climbed up carefully, illuminating the beams and metal ducts. At first, everything looked normal, but when I followed the duct leading to the cold room, I noticed something strange. It didn't extend all the way to the exterior wall like it should have. It simply stopped against an interior wall. There was no proper outlet. It looked like warm air was being pushed into a closed space. That made no technical sense. I climbed down and returned to the bedroom. With the flashlight, I examined the wall where the duct ended on the other side. I knocked lightly with my knuckles and the sound was hollow, much more hollow than the rest of the wall. I grabbed a putty knife and began scraping a small section of plaster near the base. The drywall came off far too easily. There was no solid resistance behind it, just emptiness. I kept removing material carefully until I opened a hole large enough to shine the flashlight inside. The beam revealed a narrow space within the wall. Not huge, but not just plumbing space either. It was deep enough for someone to crouch inside, and then I saw something that shouldn't have been there. At the back of the cavity were 2 neatly folded blankets and several empty plastic wrappers scattered on the floor. I froze, just staring, trying to process what I was seeing. It didn't look old. The blankets weren't covered in thick dust, nor did they have that strong smell of something stored for decades. When I shined the light closer, I could see they were ordinary blankets, the kind sold at any large store. The wrappers looked like cereal bar and snack packaging. Nothing moldy, nothing deteriorating. That hadn't been there for years. My first impulse was to call my wife, but something made me hesitate. I didn't want to scare the kids without being sure what was happening. I listened carefully, my head almost against the open wall. At first, I only heard the distant sound of the TV downstairs, then a very faint sound from inside the cavity. Not loud, like fabric being slowly adjusted against wood. I froze instantly. My entire body tensed. I held my breath to be sure it wasn't echo or wind moving through the disconnected duct. The heating was on, but air didn't make that kind of sound. This was different. Too controlled. I stepped back slightly, keeping the flashlight pointed into the hole. I didn't see immediate movement, but I had the clear sensation that something had just shifted inside. My heart pounded in my chest so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Then I heard a faint click from the upper part of the wall, like someone shifting their weight. Not loud, not dramatic, subtle. And that was what terrified me the most. I called my wife softly at first, trying not to panic. She didn't hear me because of the TV. I raised my voice and asked her to come upstairs, alone, without the kids. While waiting, I didn't take my eyes off the opening. The air coming from it was clearly colder than the rest of the room. Now I understood why. It wasn't just heating failure. There was a large hollow space behind that wall, and if someone had been using it, that would explain the temperature difference. My wife entered the room asking what was wrong. I pointed to the hole and handed her the flashlight. When she saw the blankets and wrappers, her face drained of color. She whispered if it could be old. I said it didn't look old. There wasn't enough dust, no strong stale smell, it looked too recent. That's when we heard a clear sound from inside the wall. Not loud, but unmistakable. The shift of weight, like someone repositioning themselves in a tight space. My wife gripped my arm so hard it hurt. I felt cold shoot up my spine. I leaned closer to the opening again, trying to listen. And then I heard something that still gives me chills. Breathing, very low, very controlled. Not wind, not ventilation. Someone trying to breathe without making noise. I didn't hesitate. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911 while still staring at the hole. As the phone rang, I heard a quick sound, fabric scraping, followed by something lightly hitting wood higher up, near the section of wall that faced the hallway. While explaining to the operator, I heard movement, faster this time. No longer slow and controlled. It was a clear shift, like someone trying to get out. I stepped back immediately and pulled my wife out of the room. I closed the door and stood in the upstairs hallway listening. The kids were still downstairs watching TV, unaware. I told my wife to stay with them near the front door. I remained upstairs, staring at the closed door of the cold room. Then I heard muffled footsteps from inside the wall, moving toward the attic, like someone crawling through the structure of the house. The wood beneath my feet vibrated slightly. The pull-down attic ladder was closed, but I could hear movement above it. A light weight crossing the beams. Not an animal, not the irregular scrambling of a raccoon. It was measured, rhythmic, someone who knew where to step. At one point I heard insulation shifting in the attic, as if pushed aside. Then absolute silence. That's when we heard the sirens in the distance. I had never felt such relief from that sound. But I still couldn't relax, because the silence above me didn't feel empty. It felt like someone was standing still, waiting. The police arrived quickly and went upstairs with flashlights raised. I explained everything as they climbed. One officer went straight to the attic. The other stayed with me in the hallway. When they pulled down the attic ladder and shined their lights, it was clear the insulation had been displaced in one corner. There was a small opening between two beams that led directly into the top of the cavity inside the wall. They called for backup immediately. When they moved the insulation aside, they found a compressed space, large enough for someone to hide. In the accumulated dust were recent marks from knees and hands. Light footprints. Still clear, but the person was no longer there. They searched the entire house in the snow-covered yard. In the backyard, they found something that confirmed everything. Fresh footprints leading along the side of the house toward the wooded area behind the property. The prints were narrow and deep, as if someone wearing thin boots had left in a hurry. To this day, I don't know how long someone had been using that space. What disturbs me most is thinking that for weeks that room was cold, because someone had been breathing inside the wall. And that night, when I knocked on the wall and began removing the plaster, I may have been just inches away from someone listening to me from the other side. Story 3. I was 16 years old when this happened. My parents had just bought an old house in rural Kansas in a small town near Salina. The house was simple, 2 stories, wooden structure, the kind built in the 1950s. It wasn't huge, but it had a large attic accessed by a pull-down ladder in the second-floor hallway. We had moved in about 3 weeks earlier, and were still in that phase of organizing boxes and throwing things out. Since I was on school break, I spent a lot of time at home helping my parents. My dad worked at a mechanic shop and my mom had long shifts at the hospital in the neighboring town. Many afternoons, I was alone in the house. At first, nothing seemed strange. Old houses make noise, wood cracks, wind hits the siding, that kind of thing. I'd lived in old houses before. I'm not the type who scares easily. The first time I heard something different was on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the second-floor hallway organizing some boxes near my room when I heard a sound above the ceiling. It wasn't a sharp crack. It was a step. Slow. Weight shifting from one side to the other. I froze instantly, staring up, trying to decide if it could be wind or the wood expanding. I waited. A few seconds later, I heard another one. 2 steps, spaced apart, like someone walking slowly over the attic beams. My heart sped up, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal, a raccoon, a squirrel, anything. But the pattern felt wrong. It wasn't scratching, it wasn't scurrying. It was heavy, measured. And what happened next was worse. When I started walking down the hallway, I heard the sound move above me, as if it were following my steps. I stopped on purpose, standing completely still in the middle of the hallway, just listening. The silence lasted about 3 seconds. Then I heard one last step above me, like whatever was up there had stopped almost at the same time. My stomach tightened instantly. I said out loud without thinking, "Dad?" Even though I knew he was at work. No response. After a few seconds, the silence returned to the normal quiet of an empty house. I climbed onto a chair and pushed against the pull-down attic ladder with my hand, just to see if it was properly secured. It was completely closed, aligned with the ceiling. It didn't look disturbed. That afternoon, I didn't have the courage to go up. I convinced myself it had to be an animal, but something didn't fit. The sound had too much weight to be small. In the following days, the same thing happened, but only when I was alone. Never when my parents were home. At night, with everyone watching TV or eating dinner, the attic was completely silent. But during the afternoons, when I was alone upstairs, the steps came back. Always slow, always spaced out, and always matching my movements in the hallway. If I entered my room, I'd hear a slight shift above me. If I walked toward the bathroom, I'd hear 2 or 3 movements along the beams. I tried recording it on my phone once, but the sound was too muffled to capture clearly. Eventually, I started avoiding the hallway when I was alone. I stayed downstairs more often. Still, sometimes I'd hear something move above the attic ladder, and it only happened when I knew no one else was in the house. After nearly a week of this, I began doubting myself. Maybe I was getting paranoid. New house, new town, new school coming soon. But that Friday afternoon made it impossible to ignore. My parents had gone shopping in the neighboring city and I was alone, organizing boxes in my room. When I stepped into the hallway to take some trash downstairs, I clearly heard 3 steps above me. Not fast, slow, with exact spacing between them. I stopped, the sound stopped. I took 2 steps toward the bathroom. Above me, 2 steps followed. My heart pounded. It didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like a response. I stood there for nearly a full minute staring at the ceiling. The silence that followed wasn't comforting. It was heavy. That day, I decided I was going up to the attic and ending it. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and pulled the attic ladder down. It came down with the dry creak of old springs. The air from above was cold, with that strong smell of dust and aged insulation. I climbed slowly, step by step. When my head passed ceiling level, I shined the light around. Exposed beams, yellowed insulation, old boxes left by the previous owner. Nothing out of place at first glance. I stepped fully into the attic, balancing carefully on the beams, moving the flashlight in a slow circle. Dust lay evenly across the surfaces. No visible footprints besides the ones I was starting to leave. I walked carefully, checking every corner. No movement, no sound. Everything seemed intact. I stayed up there about 5 minutes, inspecting thoroughly, even the far end where the roof slopes low and you have to crouch. The dust was uniform. No trails, no recent disturbances. I ran my hand along one beam. It was coated in fine dust that clearly hadn't been touched in a long time. No strange smells, no objects out of place, nothing suggesting someone had been using the space. I even tapped one of the boards lightly with my foot to see if it would cause any unusual sound below. Nothing but normal wood echo. At that point, I started to feel a little ridiculous for being so scared. Maybe it really was structural movement reacting to my steps. After checking one more time, I climbed down. When my feet hit the hallway floor, I pushed the ladder back up firmly until I heard the dry click of it locking into place. That day was no different. I pushed until I felt resistance and heard the mechanism snap shut. I stood there for a few seconds, almost expecting an immediate sound. Nothing happened. The house was silent. I even felt a small sense of relief, like I had finally proven there was nothing up there. A few hours later, it was dark outside. My parents still hadn't returned. I went downstairs to grab something from the kitchen, then came back up. As soon as I turned into the hallway, something felt wrong. Not a sound, a visual difference. The attic ladder wasn't fully closed. It wasn't open either, but it was slightly misaligned, as if it had been pulled down a few inches and then pushed back up without locking properly. It wasn't flush with the ceiling like I had left it. My stomach went cold instantly. I was absolutely sure I had closed it completely. I always checked. I stood there for several long seconds trying to convince myself maybe I had rushed and hadn't locked it all the way. But I remembered the click. I remembered pushing hard until it resisted. Still, I stepped forward slowly and touched the edge of the ladder. It felt slightly loose. I pushed it again and heard the click I was certain I had already heard earlier. My heart began pounding again. The hallway was silent, but the silence felt heavier now. I stared at the ceiling, waiting for something. Then I heard a very faint sound above the attic panel. Not across the whole attic, just directly above the ladder. A weight shift. A short movement, like someone repositioning on their knees. My entire body locked up. I wasn't imagining it. The sound came right after I pushed the ladder back into place, as if someone had reacted. I stepped back automatically, never taking my eyes off the ceiling. My mouth was dry. When I finally managed to speak, I said loudly, "Is someone up there?" My voice echoed and faded. Then absolute silence. Not normal silence. It felt like even the air had stopped. I didn't go back up that time. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and called my dad. He answered on the third ring. I quickly explained about the ladder and the noises from the past few days. He was quiet for a moment, then said he was coming home immediately. While I was still on the phone, I heard another sound above me, a faint dragging noise moving away from the ladder as if someone were carefully retreating. A real chill ran down my spine. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't wood settling. It was controlled movement. I went downstairs and waited by the front door. When I heard their car pull into the driveway, the relief nearly made my knees buckle. I explained everything again when they came inside. My dad grabbed a large flashlight from the garage and went upstairs with me. I stayed behind him as he pulled down the attic ladder. This time it creaked slightly louder than usual. We both climbed up. He scanned the attic carefully. Everything looked the same. Even dust. No obvious trails besides our fresh footprints. He inspected every corner, even crouching near the edges where the roof met the walls. Nothing. No clear sign of anyone. But as he turned back toward the ladder opening, something caught my eye. Near the edge, very close to where the ladder meets the frame when closed, there was an area where the dust looked slightly disturbed. Not a full footprint. More like the side impression of a knee or a hand that had pressed down carefully and then lifted. It hadn't been there earlier. I was certain. My dad tried to rationalize it, maybe older marks revealed by shifting light, but I knew that wasn't true. Because earlier that afternoon, the dust had been completely smooth in that spot. What still unsettles me to this day isn't that we never found anyone. It's knowing that that night someone had enough time to pull the ladder down a few inches, hear my footsteps in the hallway, and push it almost back into place before I noticed. And that for days, while I walked alone down that hallway, someone may have been above me, moving slowly, matching every step I took. Story 4. I am 37 years old, and I bought my first house on my own last year in Baltimore in an older area near Hampton. It's a row house, one of those very narrow ones attached to each other with a tight side alley separating the block of houses from the back wall. I moved in October, right after my divorce. I wanted a place that was just mine, something I could renovate slowly over time. The house is old, early 1900s, with steep stairs, creaking floors, and a small attic accessed by a pull-down ladder in the second-floor hallway. The attic isn't finished. Just exposed beams, old insulation, and a small triangular window that faces the side alley. I almost never went up there because there was nothing besides a few boxes left by the previous owner. I never installed a light up there. No outlet either. I never needed one. On that specific night, I woke up around 2:40 a.m. It wasn't because of a noise, it was because of light. My bedroom is directly below the front section of the attic. I was lying on my side when I noticed a reflection flickering on the opposite wall. It was faint but rhythmic, like something was blocking and unblocking a light source. At first, I thought it was headlights from a car passing by, but my house doesn't face the main road and the angle didn't make sense. I sat up in bed and looked at the ceiling. The light was coming from above, more specifically from the direction of the attic. My bedroom was dark, but the ceiling had a subtle variation in brightness, like there was an active light source up there. And that made no sense. I had never installed a light in the attic. I had never left anything plugged in. I sat there for a few seconds trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a reflection from the alley, someone passing with a flashlight or a phone, but the pattern didn't seem external. It felt like the light was coming from inside and being blocked by something moving. I got up slowly, the cold floor under my feet, and stepped into the hallway. The house was completely silent. The heater wasn't running at that moment. The only sound was the distant hum of the city far away. When I looked up at the pull-down attic ladder, I clearly saw a thin line of light escaping through the edge of the hatch. It wasn't strong, but it was there. A yellowish light, not the white light of a phone. My heart started pounding immediately. I was absolutely certain there was no bulb installed up there. I carefully pulled the ladder down. It came down with the dry creak of old hinges. The moment the ladder shifted, the light from above instantly went out. It didn't fade. It didn't dim. It shut off completely. The attic was pitch black. I stood there in the hallway with the ladder open, staring into the dark void above me. The air coming down was cold and smelled of old wood and aged insulation. No sound. I pulled my phone from my pocket and turned on the flashlight. I climbed slowly, step by step, feeling the wood vibrate lightly under my weight. When my head cleared the ceiling line, I scanned the space. Beams, dust, old boxes. Everything looked normal. No light bulb, no extension cord. Nothing to explain the light I had seen seconds earlier. I climbed fully into the attic and moved carefully along the beams, sweeping the flashlight back and forth. The accumulated dust looked mostly undisturbed, except for my own footprints beginning to form. There was no smell of smoke, no burnt wiring, nothing suggesting an electrical issue. I walked to the triangular window at the back of the attic, the one facing the side alley. That's when my stomach tightened. The window was open a few inches. I was sure it was always closed, not locked with a padlock but secured with a small metal latch. Now the latch was loose, hanging to the side. Cold early morning air flowed directly through the gap. The wooden frame was slightly damp from dew. I stepped closer and shined the flashlight outside. The alley is narrow, maybe 5 feet wide at most. Directly below the window there was a large metal can, like an industrial paint can turned upside down. It wasn't normally there. I had walked through that alley several times to take out the trash and had never seen it positioned there. It was placed almost precisely centered beneath the window, as if someone had used it to step up. The distance from the ground to the window isn't extreme, but it isn't easy either. With the can there, it would be possible. I stood there staring at it for several seconds, feeling the cold air hit my face through the open window. I didn't climb down immediately. I stayed there scanning the alley, looking for any movement. My phone's flashlight illuminated part of the neighbor's brick wall and the concrete ground below. No one was there at that moment, but the placement of the can didn't look random. It was too aligned with the window. It didn't look like wind had moved it or that it had been left there casually. The metal reflected the light in a way that revealed recent scuff marks on its side, like it had been gripped and moved not long ago. A mix of cold and adrenaline ran through me. The window wasn't broken. The wood wasn't forced. It was simply open, as if someone had managed to unlatch it from the outside or as if it had already been unlatched. I climbed down and went straight to the back door that leads into the alley. I opened it slowly and stepped outside, still holding my phone. The early morning air was cold and damp. The alley smelled faintly of distant trash and wet concrete. I approached the metal can and touched it. It was cold, but not wet enough to suggest it had been sitting there all night. Then I noticed something else. There were faint marks in the dust on the brick wall, light scratches as if someone had leaned against it to gain leverage. I looked up at the open window. And for the first time, I felt something beyond fear. It was the realization that someone had been inside my house while I was sleeping. I went back inside quickly and locked the back door, checking the latch twice. I went upstairs and pulled down the attic ladder again. This time I climbed up more carefully, flashlight steady in my hand, searching for details I might have missed before. When I illuminated the attic floor near the window, I saw something I hadn't noticed earlier. There was a subtle disturbance in the dust layer close to the opening. Not a full footprint, but it looked like the partial imprint of a sneaker, like someone had placed their foot there carefully, trying not to scatter too much dust. The insulation near the window was also slightly compressed, forming a shallow indentation. Nothing dramatic, but visible enough not to be coincidence. I stood there for what felt like a long time, trying to understand how this could have happened without me noticing anything. I hadn't heard footsteps. I hadn't heard the window being opened. The only thing that woke me up had been that flickering light in my bedroom. And now, looking at the open window and the disturbed dust, I began to understand. Maybe that light hadn't been an external reflection. Maybe it had been someone using a flashlight up there, looking around, orienting themselves in the dark. The thought that someone could have been in the attic above my bedroom while I slept made me physically nauseous. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my neck. I closed the window firmly, secured the metal latch, and tested it to make sure it was locked. Then I went downstairs and called the police, explaining that someone had likely entered through the attic. They came, examined the alley, the metal can, and the attic interior. They said there were no clear signs of forced entry, but agreed that the placement of the can and the dust marks were suspicious. They filed a report and recommended installing an additional lock on the window. What stayed with me wasn't just that someone had managed to get in. It was that in the days that followed, every time I came home from work at night, I had the impression that the attic window was slightly ajar again, not wide open, just a few millimeters out of the perfect alignment I left it in. And every time I went up to check, the latch appeared to be in place. The question was never how someone got in. It was how many times someone had already been inside before that night when I finally woke up in time to notice. Story 5. I am 29 years old, and I moved alone into an old apartment in Newark, New Jersey about 3 months ago. The building was constructed in the 1920s, with heavy wooden staircases, thick walls, and plumbing that makes noise from time to time. I chose the top floor because I like silence and didn't want anyone walking above me. The building manager made it very clear that above my apartment, there was only the ceiling structure and a small maintenance attic, accessed through a hatch in the building's hallway, not inside my unit. I work from home, so I spend a lot of time there. During the day, the building is quiet. At night, it's practically silent. It was on a Wednesday around 1:30 a.m. that I started hearing something different. It wasn't wood cracking, it wasn't pipes expanding. It was too rhythmic for that. I was lying in bed, lights off, trying to sleep, when I heard a very faint sound above my bedroom ceiling. At first, I thought it was my own breathing echoing, but when I held my breath, the sound continued. It was low, muffled but constant, a clear pattern, inhale, exhale, like someone breathing slowly, trying to be quiet. I lay completely still, my body tense, trying to determine if it was really coming from above. My bedroom ceiling is low, so the sound felt very close. It wasn't coming from the street. It wasn't from the side walls. It was directly above me. My heart began beating faster, and that made me doubt my perception. I thought maybe it was anxiety. Maybe I was misinterpreting some structural noise. But the pattern didn't change. It was too human. I grabbed my phone and checked the time to make sure I wasn't dreaming. 1:38 a.m. As I stared at the lit screen, I realized something else. Whenever I shifted slightly in bed, even a small movement, the sound seemed to pause for a second and then resume. That gave me the horrible feeling that someone was reacting to my presence. I turned off my phone screen and stayed in the dark, trying to listen more carefully. The breathing continued, very faint, as if it were coming through a thin layer of wood and insulation. I tried convincing myself it could be a ventilation duct, but my building doesn't have central air. It has wall heaters and old radiators. There shouldn't be airflow above the ceiling like that. I got up slowly and placed my hand against the bedroom wall just to ground myself in something solid. The room was cold, typical winter night, but I was sweating. My body felt like it was on full alert, as if I had woken up in the middle of something dangerous without yet understanding what. I walked to the bedroom door and opened it slightly, just enough to see into the hallway of my apartment. dark, silent. The breathing sound still came from the bedroom ceiling, and when I stepped out 2 paces, it seemed to grow fainter. I stepped back toward the room. It became clearer. That confirmed something I didn't want confirmed. It was localized. That exact spot in the ceiling. I considered calling someone, but it felt ridiculous to call the police and say, "I think someone is breathing in my ceiling." So I tried something simple. I went back to the bed, sat on the edge, and stared up, searching for shadows or vibrations in the plaster. Nothing moved, just that steady, muffled sound. And the worst part, it sounded calm. Not frantic breathing, not someone running. It was like someone lying down or crouched, just waiting. After listening for several minutes, I decided to test something. I stood up and walked to the bedroom light switch. Before turning it on, I paused and memorized the rhythm. Steady. I took a breath and flipped the light on. The sound stopped instantly. Not faded, not changed, stopped. The silence was so abrupt it felt artificial. I stood in the middle of the lit room, staring at the ceiling, waiting for movement. Nothing. I walked slowly around the room, listening. Nothing. Only the distant hum of the city and my own racing heartbeat. I waited almost a full minute. Still silence. What I felt wasn't relief. It was the uncomfortable certainty that something had reacted to the light. I took a breath, hand trembling, and turned the light off. The room returned to darkness. For a few seconds, there was nothing. I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. Then slowly, like someone testing the environment, the sound returned. First a very faint inhale, then another. The rhythm rebuilt itself, almost identical to before. My stomach dropped. That wasn't plumbing. It wasn't wind. It wasn't the building settling. It was a direct response to the environment. Light on, silence. Light off, breathing. I stood frozen in the dark, eyes adjusting, feeling the cold air and faint smell of old dust. With every cycle of that sound, I felt like I was inches away from someone, separated only by thin wood and plaster. I couldn't stay there. The vulnerability was overwhelming. I grabbed my phone and left the bedroom slowly, closing the door behind me. In the hallway of my apartment, the sound was more muffled but still noticeable when I leaned close to the bedroom door. I pressed my ear against the wood. The rhythm was steady, almost relaxed. It gave me the disturbing impression that whoever was up there thought I had gone back to sleep. My entire body was tense. I decided to check the attic access hatch in the building hallway. I threw on a coat over my pajamas and unlocked my apartment door quietly. The building hallway was dark and cold, lit only by a dim light near the stairs. The attic hatch was a square wooden panel in the ceiling of the shared hallway, a few meters to the left of my door. It had a small padlock attached to a metal latch. I had seen it before when I moved in. That night, the first thing I noticed was that the hatch looked slightly misaligned on one side. Not hanging open, but not perfectly flush like I remembered. I climbed onto one of the folding chairs kept against the wall to get closer. The padlock was intact, not forced. I touched the wood and felt something subtle. A faint vibration, almost imperceptible, like something moving above. I stood there, hand pressed to the panel, feeling the cold of the metal lock, trying to decide if I was imagining it. After a few seconds, I felt it again. Not constant, like weight shifting very slowly from one side to the other. Wind didn't make sense. There were no open hallway windows, and the attic had no direct outside ventilation. And the pattern, it was the same rhythm I had heard in my bedroom. Controlled. I climbed down, legs weak, staring up at the hatch. The padlock was still in place, intact, and that confused me most. If someone was up there, how had they entered without breaking anything? I went back into my apartment and locked the door, engaging the extra chain I rarely used. The sound was still coming from my bedroom, lower now but present. I went into the kitchen, grabbed a knife on instinct, and stood in the living room trying to think clearly. I called the building manager even though it was almost 2 a.m. He answered groggily. I explained that I was hearing breathing above my ceiling and that the attic hatch looked misaligned. He insisted the attic was locked and that only he had access. He said it was probably wood expanding due to temperature. I almost hung up but asked him to come anyway. He said it would take at least 20 minutes. While waiting, I pressed my ear against my bedroom door again. The breathing was slower now, more spaced, like whoever was up there was waiting too. I couldn't decide what was worse, the sound continuing or stopping entirely. Because if it stopped, it might mean movement. I kept pacing the living room thinking, if the padlock was intact, then no one entered from outside, which meant someone was already up there. Eventually, I noticed something change. The sound began shifting slowly toward the area above my bedroom door, as if it were moving inside the ceiling space. Then I heard a faint metallic click from the building hallway, a very light sound like metal touching metal. I froze. A few seconds later, there was a muffled sound above me, then absolute silence. The breathing stopped. At the same time, I realized the hallway sound had been the padlock being repositioned. I didn't see it, but I knew the manager hadn't arrived yet. I moved quietly to my apartment door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. The attic hatch now looked perfectly aligned, as if someone had adjusted it from the inside. When the manager finally arrived about 20 minutes later, the building was completely silent. We climbed up on the chair together. He unlocked the padlock in front of me. When he opened the hatch, cold air rushed down. He shone a large flashlight inside. Old beams, insulation, dust. At first glance, nothing unusual. But when he moved the light toward the center of the space, we saw something new. There was a compressed area in the insulation, forming a flattened shape large enough for someone to lie down. It didn't look old. The insulation was still slightly molded, like it had been used recently. He walked carefully across the beams, scanning the rest. No one was there. No backpack, no visible flashlight. But near the far end, almost directly above my bedroom, there was a partially hidden empty plastic bottle tucked under insulation. It wasn't covered in thick dust. He picked it up with his fingertips and looked at me without speaking. What stayed with me wasn't that we didn't find anyone. It was realizing that someone had been up there while I was lying in bed listening, and that they had enough time to hear me leave the bedroom, hear me open my apartment door, adjust the hatch from inside, and stay silent until everything seemed normal. Story 6. I am 35 years old, and I moved alone into a single-story house in rural North Carolina at the beginning of this year. The town is small, near Asheville, and the house sits on a very quiet street with large yards and few lights at night. I bought the property from an older man who was moving to Florida, so the structure is old but seemed well maintained. It's a simple house, just one floor, with a central hallway connecting the 2 bedrooms and the bathroom. The ceiling isn't very high, and there's no second floor, just the ceiling and the space between the roof and the drywall. Access to the attic space is through a square hatch with a metal pull handle in the hallway ceiling. I live alone and work as a network technician, so I spend a good amount of time at home. The first few weeks were quiet, nothing unusual beyond the normal sounds of an old house. It was on a Saturday night around 2 a.m. that I started noticing something different. I was in the living room watching TV when I heard a creak coming from the hallway ceiling. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. I immediately assumed it was wood contracting because of the temperature drop. It gets pretty cold at night here, even in summer. I ignored it and kept watching. A few minutes later, I got up to grab water from the kitchen. As I walked through the hallway, I heard it again. A creak, followed by another, like something adjusting above the ceiling. I stopped instinctively. The sound stopped at the exact same moment. I stood still for a few seconds, waiting for another crack. Nothing. I took 2 more steps. Above me, another creak followed in the same direction I was walking. My stomach tightened, but I still tried to stay logical. Wood makes noise, that's normal. I went back to the living room with my glass of water, but now I was paying attention to every step I took. The TV was on low, and even so I could distinguish any noise above the ceiling. I waited a few minutes while sitting still to see if the sound would return on its own. Nothing. The silence felt normal as long as I wasn't moving. After a while I stood up again, this time intentionally, and walked slowly toward the hallway. The moment my foot touched the wooden floor near the hallway entrance, I heard the creak above me. It wasn't random. It was displacement, like weight shifting from one point to another directly over where I was standing. I stopped, the sound stopped. I stared at the white ceiling, which showed no visible marks. My heart began beating harder, and I tried to control my breathing to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting sounds. I decided to make the test clearer. I took 3 slow steps to the middle of the hallway. Above me, 3 creaks followed, spaced almost in the same rhythm. They weren't the sharp snaps typical of expanding wood. They were compression sounds, like something pressing on the structure and then relieving its weight. I stopped abruptly. The sound ceased immediately. I stood there motionless for nearly a full minute, waiting for any variation. Nothing. The silence returned to its usual late-night pattern. A chill ran down my back, not from temperature, but from the recognition of a pattern. I didn't want to accept what it seemed to be. I tried convincing myself it could be vibration from the floor transferring to the beams above. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. There was no usable attic, just a tight space between the ceiling and the roof. Even with the unease building in my chest, I continued the test. I took 2 more steps toward the bedroom. The creak came again, now closer to my bedroom door. It was as if something was positioned exactly above the central hallway, tracking the line where I walked. I turned around and walked back toward the living room. The sound shifted with me following my return. I stopped in the middle of the hallway. Silence again. The entire house felt like it was holding its breath with me. I stared at the ceiling, searching for any deformation in the drywall. Nothing visible. No new cracks, no stains. Just a smooth white surface separating me from whatever was above by a few inches of wood and insulation. That's when I felt a change in the air. It wasn't wind. It was the sense that the space above wasn't empty. A physical awareness, like when you enter a room and know someone is there before you see them. I walked to the attic hatch in the hallway ceiling. It was positioned almost exactly where the sounds had been clearest. I stared at the small metal handle, trying to decide whether going up was a good idea. My whole body was tense. I grabbed a chair from the kitchen and placed it beneath the hatch. Before climbing up, I stood still for a few seconds. No sound came from above while I remained motionless. I stepped onto the chair. The moment my weight shifted, I heard a faint movement above, like something retreating a few inches. I climbed up slowly and grabbed the metal handle. It was cold to the touch. I pulled carefully and the hatch swung down with the dry creak of old hinges. A strong smell of dust and old insulation came down with it. I stood there with the opening exposed, waiting for immediate noise. Nothing. I turned on my phone's flashlight and aimed it upward. The space was low, maybe a little over half a meter high in the center. Wooden beams, loose insulation, electrical wiring. At first glance, completely normal. No movement, no sound. I climbed a bit higher, resting my arms on the opening, and swept the light slowly from left to right. That's when I noticed something that made me freeze. The insulation wasn't uniform. There was a compressed strip forming a clear trail, starting directly above the hallway and extending toward my bedroom. It looked as though someone had repeatedly passed along that path, pressing the material down into a marked corridor. There were no small animal footprints, no droppings, no rodent scratches. The compression was too wide for a raccoon and too organized to be random. The trail ran in a straight line above the hallway, exactly where I walked. My stomach turned. The flashlight trembled in my hand. As I kept scanning, I saw that the trail extended directly above my bedroom as well. At that point, the compression was deeper, forming a wider, flattened area, almost like a spot where someone could have crouched or lain down for several minutes. My heart was racing now. I searched the edges of the attic space for any hole, any opening where someone could have entered. Nothing obvious. No displaced shingles, no broken boards, no clear point of entry. I stayed there for several seconds, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe workers had been up there before the house was sold, but the trail looked too recent. The insulation was still compressed, not hardened or aged. If it had been old, the material would have resettled irregularly over time. This was cleanly marked. I climbed down from the chair slowly, legs slightly weak, but kept staring at the open hatch. Silence above, no creaking, no movement. It was as if the space had returned to emptiness the moment I exposed it to light. Despite knowing how tight the space was, I decided to climb fully into the attic. I pulled myself up carefully onto the beams. The temperature up there was different, stuffy despite the cool night. The dust smell was stronger, almost irritating. I moved slowly along the beams, following the compressed trail with my flashlight pointed downward. With every step, the insulation made a faint dry sound beneath me. The path was too clear to dismiss. I followed it to the section above my bedroom. There, the flattened area was wider, as if someone had remained in that spot for a significant amount of time. I crouched there, imagining the perspective of whoever had been above. That's when something happened that made my entire body react. I heard a faint shift behind me, from the direction of the hallway. It wasn't loud. It was the sound of insulation being pressed very slowly. I swung the flashlight around quickly. Nothing visible, but the trail seemed to extend a few inches beyond where I had seen it before, as if someone had just retreated out of the light's reach. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stayed completely still, listening for breathing, for movement. Absolute silence. But it felt different now. Not empty, tense. I decided not to stay there waiting for something worse. I moved slowly back toward the hatch, lighting every inch ahead of me. I saw no one, no backpack, no flashlight, no personal items. I climbed down and shut the hatch firmly, pushing until I heard it lock into place. I stood in the hallway, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the creak to return. It didn't. The house was silent again. But now I knew the space above the hallway wasn't being used by wood expansion. It was being used as a path. And what unsettles me most is that there was no clear point of entry, no broken shingles, no visible opening, just a marked trail exactly above where I walked every night. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with all the lights on until dawn, listening to every sound the house made. The creaking didn't return while I stayed still. But every time I got up to go to the kitchen or bathroom, I found myself bracing to hear movement above me again. What stayed with me wasn't just the sound. It was the pattern. When I walked, something moved. When I stopped, it stopped. And the path in the insulation made it clear that it hadn't happened just once. That trail had already been formed before that night. What I can't stop thinking about is how many times someone may have walked directly above the hallway in my bedroom while I was underneath, believing I lived alone.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.